Well, good morning and welcome. I'm so pleased to welcome all of you to our worship this morning, whether you are here on site or whether you're joining us online. We're so glad you're here. We are united as one community, more together than alone. This is a liberal religious community of spiritual seekers. We welcome you all in the fullness of your age, race, ethnicity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and religious background. Our faith is not lived in creeds, but in deeds, not in the hereafter, but in the here and now. Our core values are freedom, reason, respect, and love. If you're visiting us for the first time, whether here in person or online, also a very special welcome to you. I hope that today's message speaks to you and that we will see you again. If you're here in person, please be sure to sign our guest book before you go so that we can stay in touch and so that we can also help you connect to what you may be looking for. If you're visiting online, let us know you're here by putting a comment in the YouTube chat after this, that's next to with this video, so that we can also reach out to you and personally welcome you to this beloved community. And now we'll begin our worship service with our prelude. Thank you, Joy. In the Unitarian Universalist tradition, we light a chalice to symbolize that we are entering sacred space and preparing our hearts and our minds for the blessing of beloved community. That happens whenever we gather. I invite you to join with me in the chalice lighting up on the screen. We hallow this time together by kindling the lamp of our heritage. I invite you to join with me as you are willing and able in prayer and meditation. Our prayer is called We Need One Another by George Odell. We need one another when we mourn and would be comforted, when we are in trouble and afraid, when we despair, in temptation, and need to be recalled to our best selves again. We need one another when we would accomplish some great purpose and cannot do it alone. In the hour of our successes, when we look for someone to share our triumphs, and in the hour of our defeat, when with encouragement we might endure and stand again. We need one another. We need one another when we come to die and would have gentle hands prepare us for the journey. All our lives we are in need, and others are in need of us. I invite you to rise in body or spirit for our opening hymn, number 368, Sing to the Power. And it's got different parts in it, so you may want to use your hymnals for this instead of the screen. But if you know the song at the back of your hand, your choice. Some of you, I'm sure, will. That was well done. And now for our Time for All Ages, we're doing a little bit differently this time. We have a video with the pictures so that everyone can see the pictures of the children's story. And it is called The Woman Who Named Things by Catherine Brown and Cynthia Ryland.
The Old Woman Who Named Things, written by Cynthia Ryland, illustrated by Catherine Brown, published by Voyager Books. Once there was an old woman who loved to name things. She named the old car she drove Betsy. She named the old chair she sat in Fred. She named the old bed she slept on Roxanne. And she named her old house Franklin. Every morning she would get out of Roxanne, have a cup of cocoa in Fred, lock up Franklin, and drive to the post office in Betsy. She always hoped for a letter from someone, but all she ever got was bills. The reason the old woman never got any letters was because she had outlived every single one of her friends. This worried her. She didn't like the idea of being a lonely old woman without any friends, without anyone whom she could call by name. So she began to name things, but she named only those things she knew she could never outlive. Her car, Betsy, had more get up and go than anything around. Her chair, Fred, had never sagged a day in his life. Not a creak or moan had she ever heard out of her old bed, Roxanne. And her house, Franklin, had been standing straight for over 100 years and still didn't look a day past 20. The old woman never worried about outliving any of them, and her days were happy. One day when the old woman was out soaping some mud off Betsy, telling her that Franklin wouldn't want to be seen with a car that didn't keep its bumpers a little cleaner, a shy brown puppy came to the old woman's gate. The old woman had not named the gate because 2 of its hinges had rusted off, and she could tell the gate wasn't long for this world. The shy brown puppy wagged its tail. It looked a little hungry. The old woman stood beside Betsy and watched the puppy for a while. She said. Then she walked into Franklin, got a chunk of ham from her refrigerator, and came back outside. The old woman gave the ham to the hungry puppy and told it to go home. She told it that Betsy always made puppies sick, and Fred never allowed puppies to sit on him, and Roxanne wasn't wide enough for a puppy and an old woman to fit on. And besides all this, Franklin couldn't tolerate dog hair. So the puppy went away. But the next day, the puppy was back. The old woman was sitting in Fred reading a book on everlasting flowers when she saw the puppy through her window. "Go home," she called to the puppy. The puppy wagged its tail when it saw her. "Go home," she called again. But the puppy just kept wagging. The old woman noticed that it still looked a little hungry, so she went to her refrigerator. She gave the puppy a hunk of cheese and 2 biscuits. Then she told it to go home. The puppy went away. That night, as the old woman plumped up the pillows on Roxanne, she thought about the puppy. It was a very nice puppy, she thought. It was a very pretty puppy, she thought. But it couldn't stay. If it stayed, she would have to give it a name, and it could never last as long as Franklin or Fred or Betsy or Roxanne. She might outlive it, and she didn't want to risk that. She didn't want to outlive any more friends. She would just keep telling it to go home. Every day, the shy brown puppy came to the old woman's gate. Every day, she fed it and told it to go home. Always it went away, and always it came back the next day. This went on for many months. The puppy got bigger and bigger until soon it wasn't a puppy anymore. It was a dog. And it was still a dog with no name. In all this time, the old woman had gotten a new dresser that she had named Bill, a new wheelbarrow that she had named Francine, and a new concrete pig for her garden that she had named Bud. But the dog she faithfully fed at her gate every day still had no name. Since it had no name, the old woman didn't have to worry about outliving it, and she thought herself pretty clever in this. Then one day, the shy brown dog did not come to the old woman's house. She sat in Fred and watched the gate all day long, but the dog never came. The old woman felt sad. The next day again, the dog did not come. The old woman drove Betsy around town looking for the dog, but she did not find it. The old woman felt even sadder. The following day, when still the dog did not come, the old woman knew she had to do something. She picked up her telephone and called the dog catcher. "Have you caught any shy brown dogs?" the old woman asked the dog catcher. "We got a whole kennel full of shy brown dogs, ma'am," said the dog catcher. "Was yours wearing a collar with its name on it?" "No," said the woman sadly, and she hung up the telephone. The old woman sat and thought about the shy brown dog who had no collar with a name. Wherever it was, no one would know that it was supposed to come to the old woman's gate every day, that she was supposed to feed it and tell it to go home every day, that things were supposed to be this way. The shy brown dog had no collar and no name, and no one would ever be able to know these things about it. The old woman made a decision. She locked up Franklin and drove Betsy to the dog catcher's kennel. She said to the dog catcher, "I've come to find my dog." He asked her what color it was. "It's brown," she said. He asked her how old it was. "About a year old," she said. Then he asked her what its name was. The old woman thought a moment. She thought of all the old dear friends with names whom she had outlived. She saw their smiling faces and remembered their lovely names. And she thought how lucky she had been to have known these friends. She thought what a lucky old woman she was. "My dog's name is Lucky," she told the dog catcher. He led her to a big yard full of white dogs and black dogs and brown dogs. The old woman looked and looked and looked, and finally she saw her own shy brown dog sitting beside a gate. The dog was looking at Betsy parked in the driveway. The old woman called out, "Here, Lucky!" And at the sound of her voice, the shy brown dog came running. From that day on, Lucky lived with the old woman, and he always came when his name was called. It turned out that Betsy didn't make all dogs sick, and Fred was happy to allow a dog to sit on him. Franklin really didn't mind a little dog hair. And every night, Roxanne was sure to make herself plenty wide enough for a shy brown lucky dog and the old woman who named him.
And that is the end of the story. So we're a caring community where we share the joys which lift our hearts and the sorrows which bring us pain. As part of our worship service, we take time for the expression of our joys, sorrows, and concerns. There are stones at the back and here in front, and when the music begins, you're welcome to come forward as you wish. Take a stone to represent whatever is in your heart or thoughts, and place it in the bowl of water, which represents this beloved community. And if you're going on to RE, just put your stone in the water and continue right on out that door to your classes. Let us begin. May the joys and sorrows represented by these stones be held in the crucible of this beloved community, and may we know that we are not alone. Our reading this morning is by Howard Thurman. There is something in you that waits and listens for the sound of the genuine in other people. If you can't hear it, then you are reduced by that much. If I were to ask you, what is the thing that you desire most in life, you would say a lot of things off the top of your head, most of which you wouldn't believe, but you would think that you were saying the things that I thought you ought to think that you should say. But I think that if you were stripped to whatever there is in you that is literal and irreducible, and you tried to answer that question, the answer may be something like this. I want to feel that I am thoroughly and completely understood, so that now and then I can take my guard down and look out around me and not feel that I will be destroyed with my defenses down. I want to feel completely vulnerable, completely naked, completely exposed, and absolutely secure. Please remain seated for our meditative hymn, number 352, Find a Stillness. As many of you know, I served Emerson Unitarian Universalist Chapel in West St. Louis County for 10 years. It's the longest holding job I've ever had in my life, a decade. And it remains a small congregation where everyone knows everyone, where love and care abound, just like here. One of my favorite times of the week was the hour or so before worship started on Sunday, when there were only two of us in the building, me and Carol Jose. Carol started coming to Emerson after her second partner passed away. She was in her 70s, and she realized that she needed to build a new life for herself. And that's how she found her way to Emerson. And by the time I arrived, she had become the coffee lady, which is why she got there as early as I did. Her ministry was getting everything ready for coffee hour. So when I smelled the brewing coffee, I'd head to the kitchen to hang out with Carol. We'd talk about our week. We'd talk about politics because we both were avid NPR listeners. And we talked about so many other things. And she was so positive and so interested in everyone around her, including me. But one Sunday, she was different. She moved more slowly, and she seemed very absent-minded. And she told me that her sister had died that week. She was my best friend, Carol said, and I'm going to be so lonely. But it's not just that I lost her, it's that I'm of the age when there is almost always someone dying, someone you're saying goodbye to. I'm tired of saying goodbye. I'm tired of funerals. I usually keep moving because what else can I do? But this time it's hard to breathe, and I wonder how much more I can take. And it was really something to hear this, because this is not the Carol that she showed herself to everyone else in the congregation. I had never seen Carol vulnerable. And I didn't know that she had been carrying this growing heaviness. And I've reflected on this conversation many, many times in the years since. And I credit this as a pivotal moment when I began to understand, not just intellectually, but emotionally and spiritually, in my 37-year-old mind that had never considered this or realized this, that this is part of the life cycle that most of us will get to, that some of us are in right now or are just starting to experience. And that's what our wisdom story was about this morning. This woman, this beautiful woman, has outlived all her friends. And she's decided that it's too hard to remember all their names, and she's no longer going to name things that could die before her, which is pretty much anything that is alive in her mind. So she names her furniture, her car, her house, even her wheelbarrow. And of course, just when she thinks she's figured it all out, this little dog shows up. and shows up and shows up. And she keeps him at the gate, away from her home. She feeds him and then tells him to go, which he does. And this is her way to protect herself from all those thoughts and longings that made her feel vulnerable, or so she thought. There are so many different ways to understand vulnerability, and I want to focus on two of them this morning. The vulnerability that we choose to go into, and the vulnerabilities that choose us. And how these two kinds of vulnerability, the ones we choose and the ones that choose us, how they work together in our lives to open the gate and let the dog into the house. In other words, to make our lives richer, more whole, and a force for good. So let's start with choosing vulnerability. Choosing vulnerability means that you willingly enter into places that are tender, even risky, maybe even dangerous, physically or emotionally. One example of choosing vulnerability is when you're starting a relationship, like a friendship or a possible partnership. And then there's that moment, right? There's that moment when you've gone on like this for a while and you have to decide whether you're going to move beyond the basic hi, how are yous towards that deeper stage when it's time to open yourself up to see if you can trust each other, to see if there's a possibility of a deeper connection. To use the words of our reading by Howard Thurman, you are listening for the sound of the genuine in other people. This chosen vulnerability can feel dangerous and unsettling. Will the other person respect you? Understand the importance of what you're sharing. Understand that you are taking a risk, and then take the risk themselves to be vulnerable to you. Or will they keep you at the gate? Or worse, take advantage of you? Those are the fears, aren't they? That if we leave ourselves vulnerable, we could become isolated and even more vulnerable to harm. So many of us choose at some point in time to keep the dog at the gate, right? And to tell the dog to go home. But at a certain point, relationships can only go so far if you aren't willing to be vulnerable with each other. And this remains true no matter how old the relationship is. That's choosing vulnerability. Vulnerability is important. It is essential for authentic relationships. You keep taking chances with the people you love, and hopefully the love gets deeper and deeper, and you become stronger and stronger. That's the vulnerability that we choose. And this kind of vulnerability can be very, very empowering. It can actually make you stronger, more whole. But there's a kind of vulnerability that isn't a choice. The old woman in our story didn't choose to be the last of her friends still living. Carol's vulnerability that morning wasn't a choice. Some kinds of vulnerability happen because life happens. There are significant moments of vulnerability that are common to each stage in life. Being born, taking a first step, speaking your first word, starting school, graduating, leaving home, raising children, starting a job, getting married, the death of older relatives, taking care of the elders in our lives, retiring, losing independence. I could go on. And then there are those of us who are able to bear children, getting our monthly cycle, and at some point in middle age, losing it. We are always vulnerable in ways we didn't choose. Vulnerable by the mere act of living and the changes in our bodies. So these kinds of being vulnerable just are. And there really isn't much we can do about them. Life happens. But then there are also the vulnerabilities we choose that aren't so benign, that are systemic. And we saw this during the pandemic. We're still seeing it. Who was most at risk of COVID at the beginning of the pandemic? the poor, people of color, the imprisoned, those with disabilities or chronic health issues, those most vulnerable to misinformation about the COVID vaccine. And we saw much higher rates of infection and death in those communities because of systemic vulnerabilities that were imposed upon those communities by our larger systems. Environmental racism is another example of systemic vulnerability. Which communities are more likely to live close to heavy industry, interstates, garbage dumps, have contamination in the water and air? In this country, your income level, your skin color, your gender identity, your physical and mental health, and more are strong indicators of how vulnerable you are to things you did not choose. In Unitarian Universalism, both kinds of vulnerability, the kind that you choose and the vulnerabilities that choose you, are important shapers of how we understand what we are here for, what our core reason for being is. If you look at our values, our core values, and I talked about these values last month when I introduced our revised principles and purposes. Those values are love, interdependence, justice, generosity, pluralism, transformation, and equity. Every one of our principles and values invites us to choose vulnerability. You can't love without being vulnerable. You can't live the value of interdependence if you leave the dog at the gate. You gotta let the dog in. Being generous is risky. What if you give of yourself and your resources and it doesn't pan out? Being committed to transformation means being open to change, and change always means letting go of something. Our value of pluralism means embracing differences, which means moving out of our comfort zone. That's a vulnerable thing to do. And the value of equity, that every person has the right to flourish, means rethinking our place in society and what we are entitled to. And that's a vulnerable thing to do, whether you are fighting for your right to flourish or looking at the privilege by which you are able to flourish. So to be Unitarian Universalist is always at some level choosing vulnerability. And why is this so important? Because we want every single one of us to flourish, to grow, to live richly. To us, the metaphors in our wisdom story, to use those metaphors, we call ourselves to give the dog a name and bring it home over and over and over again. And we do this for ourselves, and we also do this for the world and all that is in it. We value justice making so deeply. And for us, justice making means doing our part to reweave the strands that are broken in the web of interdependence that we are part of. So justice making is always vulnerable. It is always vulnerable and dangerous work, spiritually and sometimes physically. I mean, we've seen what can happen when one resists the system. You really can get hurt. So justice seeking is often heartbreaking work. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 1 step forward, 2 steps back. And in justice seeking, we may often feel like the dog waiting at the gate to be let in, and that gate is not opening. But if we are truly doing our best to live our values, then the vulnerability we choose will give us the strength, the vision, and the compassion to engage the vulnerabilities that have been placed upon so many of us without our consent. Forced vulnerability that is doing serious harm to the earth and all that is living on it. So after Carol's sister died, beloved Carol Jose, she started having more health issues. It was getting harder for her to get around, and she would get out of breath so easily. Stairs were difficult, and because she was the only one doing coffee hour, and that's how she liked it, We worried about what would happen when she couldn't do it anymore. So, of course, we struck a committee to figure out a plan, a succession plan for Carol, which is what we often do. We have succession plans, not only when people are no longer able to do their volunteer work, but just because we know there always needs to be change and always needs to be fresh eyes. So the plan, of course, our plan was to recruit other people to start working with Carol and be ready to take over when she couldn't do it anymore. And it seemed to make a lot of sense. But this was the problem. Nobody asked Carol. Probably because they were afraid of talking to Carol, because she had developed this iron grip on the church kitchen. It was her kitchen. And even as it got harder physically, she was determined to keep going and had resisted any suggestion that it was getting too hard for her. She loved what she did. She knew every child by name and what their favorite treat was. One of her missions was to use her leverage as the treat provider to convince the kids that they should really learn how to write cursive. How else, she said, are you going to read everything my generation is leaving behind? She was not above using bribery. So when she learned that she was going to get helpers with no explanation of why this was happening, it felt like she was being pushed out. She felt vulnerable, which made her angry and afraid. So what do you think happened when her helpers showed up? We all learned what Carol's stink eye looked like. And she scared all those helpers right out of the kitchen. So one Sunday morning during our chat, our delightful 1 hour before worship starts chat, without any helpers to be seen, I asked if we could talk about it. And in the quiet hour before anyone arrived, before any helpers were seen, she shared that she did have concerns about her health, but she wanted it to be her call when she needed help and not anyone else's. And when she was ready for helpers, would they please accept the way she did things and not try to change anything in her kitchen? There would be time enough for that when she was gone. But everything was changing for her, and she needed this. So Carol responded to a vulnerability she didn't choose by choosing to be vulnerable with me. So obviously we had to reevaluate what our assumptions had been and how our process was manipulative, because we had forced vulnerability upon Carol, and without intending to, had placed her like the dog at the gate, no longer in her own home. So we had to be vulnerable enough to admit that we had made a mistake and to say sorry. And we abandoned the need for a rock-solid succession plan that guaranteed coffee every morning, and instead shifted our focus to helping Carol stay in that kitchen as long as she could and do what she loved. People just seemed to show up when she came with her groceries and had trouble carrying them up the stairs. When she couldn't drive anymore, there were immediate offers to pick her up and bring her an hour early to do her job. And wouldn't you know it, Carol served the coffee until just a few weeks before she died, when she got a late-stage cancer diagnosis and declined rapidly. And when she died, we celebrated her life, and coffee hour was fine. The people who were needed showed up, but it took a long time for us to stop calling it Carol's Kitchen. So my question for us is this: what vulnerabilities are we choosing to live into as we engage the vulnerabilities we never asked for, but have come our way nonetheless? It is time to go to the pound, name the dog, put the dog in the car, carry him home, Bring him through the gate and into the house so that we may all flourish and love as deeply as we can. May it be so. And our closing hymn, the quintessential vulnerable hymn, is 1021, Lean on Me. Thank you. Every week, we take an offering to support the many life-saving ministries of this congregation. So let us be a generous people and let us take this morning's offering. Please join me in blessing this offering with our offering prayer. May this offering equip us to inspire love and seek justice. So, announcements. I want to say thank you to everybody who came to the talent show night and everyone who performed. Audience and performers were fantastic. Well, thank you very much. I had a blast, as you can probably tell. Oh, sorry, take my mask off. That's right. So, it was a blast. And so next month, our party is a St. Patrick's Day party on St. Patrick's Day. So wear something green, bring green food, green beverages, green music, whatever that looks like, green games, whatever that looks like. Just bring green. Oh. Well, we could do it in the fall. Talent. Yeah. Maybe we'll do a talent show worship service. We could do that. No announcements? Okay. We do have a potluck today, right? We have potluck, and Carol wanted to make sure that I told you, our other Carol in the kitchen wanted to make sure I told you that the cutlery is compostable. So don't throw it out. There's a separate bin for that. Oh, March 12th, that's Sunday. Oh, right, great. So that's Ron Glossop's birthday has been moved to March 12th after the service. All right. So please join me in extinguishing the chalice. The light of truth and meaning cannot be put out. We are keepers of this flame until we meet again. Please remain seated for the postlude.